The patterns in this book use double stockinette, along with intarsia and fair isle techniques, which are included in the book. Let's do a little bit of double board stockinette on a knitting board. This is a classic custom-made knitting board. This actually was a gift from a friend, so I don't know who made it, but this is what double stockinette looks like. It's identical on both sides of the fabric. This cast on looks ugly, but it will be pretty later on. That's a subject for another video. And this is what the fabric looks like while you're wrapping it. Any of these looms you're looking at below can produce the same fabric. Of course, it may be different gauges. This is a Kiss Dragon loom, and right now it is not set up for double board knitting. But if I take out the pin boards, so we just have the pegs opposing each other, and I put a narrower spacer in here, let me lay it out as though I were going to do so. It's a double board too. These wide ends are great while knitting what I was just knitting, which was a big blanket, but they're unnecessary for the double board. We're getting there, but we would want to take off these pinboard pieces by releasing all the washers. Now we would be just about ready to knit. What I have not done is fasten these down with washers between the two sides, as is already done on this Noble knitter. But you can see how they can be used in exactly the same manner. Of course, the Dragon is a very large gauge loom, and so it's easier to set it up for fat yarn than it is the Noble knitter. But one of the advantages of any set of parallel pegs that is movable, this one's fixed, so we only get one choice of how large the gauge is. But these are movable, all of them. And so we could take this spacer, this is an old knitting board, it's on its narrowest spacer, but this is also an opening that can slide right onto those bolts and make the opening between the boards over an inch wide. That gives you a much bigger gauge. So let's actually knit a row. There are all kinds of stitches you can do on this board, but the way to do stockinette is what we're going to talk about today. This is my peg number 1. It could also be this one, but I have chosen for it to be this one. Now we're zigzag wrapping. We wrap down to the, I'm going to call these top and bottom boards, the one away from me being top, the one near me being bottom. You could also call them near and far. Top, bottom, bottom. But we're zigzagging. We're skipping a peg every time. So near, skip a peg on far, wrap the next peg, skip a peg on near, wrap a peg, and so on, making a V all the way down. At the end, wrap across the end and begin zigzagging again, this time wrapping the pegs that were omitted in the last wrap. And although it's making zigzags or V shapes, the fabric produced looks exactly like stockinette, but it does so on both sides. It does not roll, and it is completely reversible. I always just hold the last stitch wrapped and begin to knit over. Now while I knit this over, let me talk about a couple of the things that can go wrong. One thing is sometimes new knitters have trouble with the wrap slipping off as you try to knit over. Let's see if I can make that happen. One reason it happens is because of what I actually did. I shoved it unwittingly with the tool. So making sure you pull out, up, and over is a help. Also, if you have wrapped overly tightly or loosely, it will be harder to keep from slipping. And also, don't forget you have two hands. Why should my left hand get to sit around? It's working too. I'm hooking with my right, but putting a little downward pressure on the new wraps with my left, and then they behave themselves. The second most common problem is to find that the two sides of the knitting are not symmetrical, that the stitches on one side are fatter or looser than the stitches on the other. I'm pretty satisfied that mine are even, but here's one way it happens if they're not even. First of all, you can turn the board around so you're positioned the same way to knit the next batch of stitches over. I usually don't, because it's a little bit of a different motion, a rest for my wrist, and a little bit more efficient to hook over like this. But when you do that, it's a different motion, exactly as it needs to be. And it's harder to get them perfectly even. See, I haven't actually gotten them perfectly even. However, I can either do that or start paying real attention to how far I hook over. There's also the fact that the first batch is always going to be a little bit different in size from the second batch, simply due to the fact that the amount of tension on the yarn changes. However, we can make sure it's perfectly even if it starts out pretty close using what I'm about to show you. We get to the very end of the row, hook over the last stitch, now reach down and pull evenly. And those wraps will tend to adjust themselves if you pull exactly vertically, trying to get in a position so that you can see that I'm pulling evenly. That just adjusts all the wraps, and now they're much closer to the same as each other. And if you feel like they're not, you can actually pull from underneath and wiggle them till they visually look even to you. Let's wrap one more row as a reminder. I start with this as my peg 1 and begin making V's. Skip 1 on the bottom, wrap 2 on the bottom, skip 2 on the top, wrap 3 on the top, and so forth. Another issue that knitters run into is that the edges of the work don't look neat and even. And they really should. It's not difficult to make nice, neat, even edges. And right here is where it's happening. Keeping that wrap the same tension and tightness and not letting go of it. Now when I come to the other end, there's a tendency for the two edges not to be the same because I'm not treating them quite the same. I've got to rest sometime from wrapping and knit over. So this little trick of knitting the last stitch first, so I've still got hand tension on the wrap, is one way that I prevent that. And the other way is before going back and doing my next row wrap, just make sure this hasn't grown. Give it a little tug. Make sure you're pleased with it, then bring it up and around, and it should have the same tension by feel that you felt while you were down here. Just as with absolutely every skill that involves both brain and body, some of it is mental learning and some of it is physical learning where you get the feel of what is correct tension-wise. Guard against what I just did. The camera was blocking my own view a little bit and I split that stitch. But I went back and corrected. It's not a big problem if it happens. It just makes a mess if you don't catch it. This time, just for variety, I'll turn the loom. I would say that probably more knitters do turn the loom than do it flipping this way. Also, people have asked me, I tend to push my tool down through the loop and lift it like this. There is absolutely nothing better or worse about doing this versus doing this. It's entirely what you find comfortable. I find it easier to keep control of the stitch doing it this way, but I can do it the other way, and if I did 1,000 stitches, I'd suddenly get much better at doing it this way. So don't let anybody tell you one way is wrong. Don't imagine it is. Do what works for you. It results in the same stitch. And now we're nearly at the point that we want to double check our evenness of the 2 rows of stitching and tug on them if they're not quite. The second batch I did are tighter, but here we go. I'm evening them up with proper tensioning from below. And it is coming out pretty. Okay, let me show you how to cast on to get that kind of stitch. It's exactly what we just did. Start by knotting a loop. We're making a slip knot. And your loop on peg 1, whatever you're using is peg 1. Drop the yarn tail down through and make the V's for as far as you want to go. Come back. And the only way the cast on row is different than future rows is what we're about to do next. We need a piece of contrasting yarn. Lay it over the wraps before anything's been knitted. Grab both ends from below, and you need enough that you can tie a knot in it. This will make your first few rows much easier to control. First of all, we wouldn't really be able to wrap and knit over if there wasn't something securing the first set of wraps. Now, there are other methods of casting on. I'm not trying to imply this is the only one, but this is one that works well and looks nice. That contrasting piece of yarn is sometimes referred to as an anchor cord, and it can stay in there while the whole project is being done. In the very end, we'll get rid of it. But now, not only can I knit over with ease, I'll be able to pull down the fabric that's forming before my fingers can reach it. This loom is the Noble Knitter, and the way this one is constructed, I can reach it sooner than on some others. But this one, it was hard to get a hold of. Well, there was only a row or two, and that's more typical. The Noble Knitter's a little bit unusual. They're all similar, but you can see slight differences in proportion. And speaking of proportion, sometimes people say, well, how far apart are the pegs, in the belief that that's determining the gauge of the fabric, and that's only partly true. The trip that the yarn makes around the pegs from peg to peg is the whole story. And that trip is determined somewhat by the distance of the pegs from one another. Here's what we do. See that? Now, even though I don't have much fabric yet, and that one's not very well evened up, I'm going to do it with my tool. I can now wrap and knit the next row pretty easily. Let's talk about this distance while I wrap. I'm covering distance across and distance between across, but I've also come this distance. So these looms have two things going on. These pegs are farther apart than the Noble Knitter pegs, and this opening is set wider. And this is fixed. I can't change this one. But I could widen the Noble Knitter by adding more washers in here. So this is very adjustable, and I could get fabric this thick on the Noble Knitter. But right now, it's set for thinner fabric. Another example for you. This is a Cindy wood loom, but because these pegs do oppose one another, we could just ignore the end pegs that I'm covering up and knit a scarf on these few. And you can see they're as far apart, or farther actually, farther apart on their centers than this loom. And they are farther apart left to right down the side of the loom. You judge the distance not based on edge to edge like that, but center to center. This is the center, and this is the center on the handmade loom. Center to center here is obviously wider. So this could hold even bulkier yarn used as a double loom, sometimes called double rake, double knitting board, than this. This is number 5 yarn. So my guesstimation would be that even number 6 would knit nicely on this as a double board. In case you're wondering, this is a 5/8 gauge loom. And when Cindy would labels them that way, they're saying center to center of those 2 pegs is 5/8 of an inch. Not everybody labels the same way. And very few people label the distance between the boards as part of it. That's something that you need to do. So that's a quick overview of how a double knitting board works. And there is my cord that's controlling the cast on. It's also keeping it orderly, because look here, we've got these kind of ugly loops, but here's how we neaten them up. I do have another whole video on this, but here's a quick coverage of it. Just chain one through the next one when you go to finish your project, or when it gets down far enough, as this one now is. It's very easy to do. I'm turning it in a way that you can see better than I can see, which is why I need the help of my fingertips. And you see a nice little chain forming. Then we can easily snip this yarn and just take it out. Quick look at the left and right edges. They should look like chains up the sides of the fabric. And they do. If they're pulling in and shortening the fabric, you might be wrapping a little bit too tightly at the edges. If they're loopy and sloppy, you may need to tighten up your edge wraps. That's one of those things you just have to practice with until you love the results. But it's fun to do.